At the summer festival in Traverse City, the air smelled like cherry syrup and grilled corn, and somewhere behind the bandstand a fiddle was being tuned badly and cheerfully. Ruby rode on Tyler's shoulders, both hands buried in his hair, laughing at something only she found funny. Hannah walked close beside them, holding out a lemonade for Ruby to grab without looking, the way you do for someone you've stopped thinking of as new. A stranger passing by paused near the string lights, smiling at Ruby first. "She's got your eyes," she said to Hannah. Then, turning to Tyler, warmer still, "And your smile from her dad, I'd guess." She shook her head, the kind of shake that means only good things. "You two are lucky. Not a lot of marriages look this happy anymore." Tyler's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Hannah looked at him. A whole conversation passed in that half-second, the kind two people can only have once they've stopped needing words for everything. Then she looked back at the stranger. She didn't deny it. She only smiled. "Before this goes any further, sit with that smile a second. If a stranger got it wrong about you and someone you cared for, would you correct them, or would you let the moment stay exactly the way it landed?" 3 weeks before that festival, none of this existed. Hannah Reed didn't know Tyler Bishop's name. Tyler didn't know hers either. Not really. Not the way that mattered. She'd driven up from Chicago in a car too clean for the gravel roads that ringed Grand Traverse Bay, a folder of renovation estimates on the passenger seat, and a headache that had started somewhere around Grand Rapids and never quite left. The lake house had belonged to her grandmother. Now it belonged to her. In the flat, administrative way, property belongs to people who inherit it before they're ready to. It needed a new dock, a new porch roof, and, according to the inspector who'd walked through it in April, a fairly complete change of attitude about its own age. She had 2 weeks before the next board meeting. She intended to spend exactly none of them doing anything but work. The name a neighbor gave her, over the fence, without being asked twice, was Tyler Bishop. Does odd jobs. Good with wood. Keeps to himself, mostly, since his wife passed. The last part was said gently. The way small towns say things they've long since stopped treating as gossip and started treating as fact, everyone simply carries together. He showed up at 8 in the morning with a toolbox that had seen better decades and a daughter asleep in the truck's back seat because the sitter had canceled at the last minute and there hadn't been anyone else to call. Hannah stood on the porch in a blazer that had no business being anywhere near sawdust and said, "Miss Reed, you must be the caretaker I hired." "Tyler," he said. "Just Tyler's fine." She didn't correct her own formality. He didn't push past his. That was how it began, two people addressing each other slightly wrong, both too polite, or too guarded, to notice. Ruby woke around 9, wandered onto the porch rubbing one eye, and found a woman in heels crouched by the steps, frowning at a board that gave more than the ones beside it. "You're gonna break an ankle doing that," Ruby said, flat and certain, the way only an 8-year-old manages. Hannah laughed, actually laughed, surprised by her own sound. "That's good advice." "I'm Ruby." "Hannah, are you gonna fix our porch?" "Your dad's fixing the porch." "I'm just paying him to." Ruby considered this with enormous seriousness. The way children weigh things, adults have stopped weighing it all. "Okay, you can still watch though." So she did. She sat on the steps in shoes that cost more than the dock repair while Ruby narrated everything her father did. This board, that nail, why the hammer made that sound instead of the other sound, and somewhere in that hour, without deciding to, Hannah forgot she was supposed to be checking emails. Tyler noticed. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed the way Hannah's shoulders came down from around her ears whenever Ruby spoke to her, the way she answered every one of Ruby's questions like they carried real weight, and he filed that away quietly, the way a careful man files away things he isn't ready to look at head-on. By the end of that first week, Hannah had learned 3 things about her caretaker. He worked fast, he worked quiet, and he never once mentioned what he'd done before this, not a hint, not a stray reference, nothing to build a picture from. She'd learned the 4th thing by accident, and not from him at all. An older man stopped by the lake house that Thursday, some longtime acquaintance of her grandmother's, returning a casserole dish that had apparently been on loan since some prior decade. He stopped cold at the sight of Tyler up on the porch roof, hammer in hand, sleeves rolled to the elbow. "Bishop?" the man said, squinting against the sun. "Tyler Bishop, the bridge engineer?" Tyler went very still on the ladder. "Used to be," he said. "Well, I'll be." The man turned to Hannah, delighted with himself the way people get when they think they're delivering good news. This man built half the interchange system outside Chicago. Structural genius, they used to say about him. "What in the world are you doing up on a roof, son?" Tyler climbed down slower than the moment called for. "Different life," he said, and that was the whole of the answer he offered. The man left with his casserole dish, and no further explanation, humming, entirely unaware he'd just handed Hannah a question she wouldn't ask out loud, not yet. Not to a man who'd just gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with modesty and everything to do with something he was still carrying. That afternoon, her phone rang. Diane Kessler, her assistant, calling about scheduling for the coming board session. Hannah mentioned it in passing, the way you mentioned something odd and slightly funny, that the caretaker up here used to be some big engineer in Chicago. Imagine that, and there was a pause on the line, half a second too long to be nothing at all. "Diane? Sorry, signal's bad up there." "What'd you say his name was?" "Bishop. Tyler Bishop." Another pause, longer this time. "Doesn't ring a bell," Diane said, in a voice that suggested it rang several bells at once, all of them somewhere she'd rather not stand near. That night, after Ruby was asleep and the house had gone quiet, the way houses do once a child stops moving through them, Tyler sat at his kitchen table and opened a drawer he mostly kept closed. Inside was a single-framed commendation, gone slightly yellow at the corners, from a firm in Chicago that no longer existed under that name. He didn't read it. He never really needed to anymore. He only needed, on certain nights, to know it was still there, proof that the man who used to exist hadn't been entirely erased, even though he'd chosen, deliberately, on purpose, over years, to disappear from that life completely. 2 states away, in an office, with a view he'd fought hard to earn, Marshall Cade was working through routine invoices from a lakefront renovation project his company had recently taken an interest in, contractor payments, permit fees, the kind of paperwork that crosses a desk, leaves no impression, and gets filed within the hour. Then he saw the name, Tyler Bishop. He set the folder down slowly. The way you set something down when moving too fast might make it louder than it already is, and sat there a long moment, doing absolutely nothing at all, just breathing, just recalculating everything he thought he'd finished burying. Back in Traverse City, the days kept folding gently into one another, softer than either of them had expected going in. Hannah started staying later than the job required. She told herself it was the estimates needing rechecking, or the porch swing squeaking in a way that needed one more look, or the light being better for photographs in the evening. None of that was quite a lie. None of it was the whole truth either. One evening she brought over takeout, because it seemed rude not to, given how long Tyler had worked past sundown that week. "Least I can do," she said, setting the bag on the porch railing. "You've basically rebuilt this whole place from the ground up. You're paying me for that. I know. This isn't payment. This is dinner." Ruby appeared in the doorway in socks with no shoes, delighted by the smell before she'd even seen the bag. "Are you staying, Miss Hannah?" Hannah glanced at Tyler. He gave the kind of shrug that means yes without committing anyone to saying it out loud. She stayed. They ate on the porch steps, plates balanced on knees, Ruby doing most of the talking, the way children do when they haven't yet learned that silence between adults can mean something is happening underneath it. At one point, Ruby reached over and tugged Hannah's sleeve to show her a firefly cupped carefully in both hands. And Hannah leaned in close, genuinely delighted, forgetting for a moment that she'd ever had anywhere else to be. Tyler watched the two of them from the step below, an expression on his face he didn't yet have a name for. It was, on paper, a very simple evening. It didn't feel that way to either of them, and both of them knew it. And neither said so. Consider, for a moment, how rarely a simple evening actually stays simple once you've started paying attention to who's in it with you. There were more evenings like it after that, small and unannounced, the kind that don't get planned so much as they get allowed to happen. Hannah started keeping a spare pair of boots in her trunk, After the second time she'd ruined a pair of flats walking the orchard rows. Ruby started saving her school drawings to show Hannah specifically, not her father, which Tyler noticed and said nothing about, filing it beside all the other small things he was choosing not to look at directly. One Saturday, Hannah showed up with a box of baking supplies she didn't fully know how to use, insisting she and Ruby were going to make cherry hand pies the proper way, whatever that meant to a woman who had, by her own admission, never turned on the oven in her Chicago apartment for anything but reheating. Ruby found this endlessly funny. Tyler stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a while, arms crossed, watching flour end up everywhere except the bowl, and didn't step in to fix a single mistake, because it wasn't really about the pies. "You're doing it wrong," Ruby told Hannah eventually, echoing, almost word for word, what her father had said in the workshop weeks before. "I'm aware," Hannah said, laughing, wiping flour off her cheek with the back of a floury hand. "Everyone around here seems very sure about how things are supposed to be done." "That's 'cause we're right," Ruby said, entirely without malice, and went back to crimping the edge of a pie crust with the fierce concentration only a child brings to something that doesn't matter at all and matters enormously at the same time. Tyler caught Hannah's eye across the kitchen. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The pies came out slightly burnt on one side, and nobody mentioned it, and all three of them ate them anyway, standing at the counter, laughing about nothing in particular until well past when Ruby should have been in bed. The complication arrived the following week, in the form of a town council notice taped to the community board outside the general store, between a lost dog flyer and an ad for firewood. Hannah read it twice, standing in the parking lot, feeling something cold settle low in her stomach before she'd even finished the second sentence. Reed Harbor Group proposed lakefront development, Zone C. Zone C included the orchard, Tyler's orchard, the one she'd walked through twice now, once with Ruby pointing out which trees bore the sweetest cherries, once alone, thinking about nothing in particular. She drove straight to her grandmother's house, then straight back out again, then finally sat in the driveway and called her Chicago office instead of driving anywhere at all, because there was nowhere left to drive to that would make any of this make sense. She'd approved a broad expansion strategy months earlier, in a conference room, half distracted, mostly trusting the people who'd built the deck she was signing off on. She hadn't looked closely at Zone C. She'd had no reason to, until the reason had a name and an 8-year-old daughter and a habit of fixing porch swings like they mattered more than anything on his invoice. That night, she sat at her grandmother's kitchen table, with the renovation folder open in front of her, and didn't look at a single page of it. She kept thinking about the porch swing Tyler had rehung that morning, the careful way he'd tested the chain twice before letting Ruby climb on, as though the smallest failure of his own hands was something he simply wouldn't allow to happen twice in one lifetime. She thought about how strange it was that she'd come up here to fix a house and somehow ended up learning, in pieces, what it looked like when a person rebuilt an entire life out of exactly that same kind of care. She didn't tell Tyler that week. She told herself it was because nothing was decided yet, nothing final, nothing worth alarming him over. That was true. It was also, she knew somewhere underneath the reasoning, a kind of cowardice dressed up neatly as patience. Marshal Cade flew into Traverse City the following Tuesday, unannounced to anyone but himself, telling the local team he simply wanted to see the site in person before any final numbers went to the board. He walked the orchard rows with his hands in his pockets, admiring nothing, measuring everything, and it was there almost too naturally to be an accident, because it wasn't one that he crossed paths with Tyler for the first time in 5 years. Neither man said much. That was the strange part. Two people with an entire buried history between them, standing 10 feet apart under cherry trees, and all that came out at first was small talk about the weather and the soil quality. "Didn't expect to find you out here," Marshall said finally, eyes steady, giving nothing away. "Didn't expect to see you either," Tyler said, just as steady. "Small world. Smaller than it should be," Tyler said, and something in the flatness of it landed exactly where he meant it to. Marshall smiled like the words hadn't touched him at all, though they had, and walked on between the trees, unhurried. Tyler stood a long moment afterward, with his jaw tight, watching a man he hadn't laid eyes on in 5 years disappear down the row like nothing at all had passed between them. He thought, standing there, about the last time he'd seen that same unhurried walk across a conference room in Chicago, 6 years and a lifetime ago, the day Marshall had told him, almost kindly, that it would be easier for everyone if Tyler simply resigned rather than let the disagreement become a formal dispute. He'd believed, at the time, that leaving quietly was the responsible thing to do. He hadn't known yet what quiet would cost him, or how long a person could go on paying for someone else's decision without ever being told the bill existed. He didn't tell Hannah any of that yet. He wasn't sure, standing among his own cherry trees, with his pulse still too fast, that he was ready to tell anyone. Hannah, watching from the porch with a mug of coffee going cold in both hands, saw the whole exchange without hearing a single word of it, and something in the stiffness of both men's shoulders told her more than any conversation could have. That night, Tyler sat Ruby down at the kitchen table with more care than usual, the way you sit a child down when you've decided, finally, to say a true thing out loud. "Hey, Bug. You know how sometimes grown-ups do different jobs at different points in their lives?" Ruby nodded, already half reaching for her book, already 3 thoughts ahead of him. "Before you were born, I did a different kind of work. Not this. Something with buildings. And bridges. Did you like it?" He thought about that longer than the question probably deserved. "Some of it. Not all of it." "Why'd you stop?" "Grown-up reasons," he said, which was as much of the truth as he could hand her without asking an 8-year-old to carry something too heavy for her arms. Ruby accepted this the way children accept most things adults won't fully explain, with a small shrug and a question about something else entirely. Already moving on, before he'd finished being relieved, she hadn't pushed further. Back in Chicago, Hannah sat across from Diane in her office and asked, as casually as she could manage, whether Diane could pull an old employment record for her. Tyler Bishop, structural engineering firm here in the city, maybe 6, 7 years back. "I just want to understand what happened. Before I make any decision about that land." Diane's pen stopped moving mid-word. "Why does it matter?" "Because he matters," Hannah said. And heard exactly how that sounded only after she'd already said it out loud. "Because I'm not going to make a call about that property without understanding who's standing on it." Diane looked down at her legal pad for a long moment, longer than the question required. She already knew exactly who was standing on it. She'd known since the name Bishop first crossed a phone line weeks earlier, and she'd said nothing, because 6 years ago she had been the compliance officer who processed his exit paperwork with her own hands, and she still kept a folder in a drawer at home that no one had ever once asked her to produce, and she had never once found the courage to bring it forward herself. "I'll see what I can find," she said, which was entirely true and nowhere near the whole truth. That night Diane sat alone in her apartment with the drawer open in front of her for the first time in longer than she wanted to count. She remembered exactly how it had felt, 6 years ago, typing up the paperwork that quietly turned a formal objection into a resignation, telling herself at the time that it wasn't her decision to make, that she was only following what had been handed to her from above. She remembered Tyler Bishop's face on his last day in that office, calm in a way that hadn't seemed calm at all up close. And she remembered thinking, even then, that something about the whole thing didn't sit right, and doing nothing about it anyway. She had told herself for 6 years that silence wasn't the same thing as lying. Sitting there now, folder in her lap, she wasn't sure she believed that anymore. That weekend, back at the lake house, Tyler was teaching Ruby how to sand the edge of a small wooden stool in his workshop, sawdust catching gold in the late afternoon light slanting through the window. Hannah wandered in under the pretense of checking on the porch estimate, and somehow ended up with sandpaper in her own hand before she'd fully decided to stay that long. "You're doing it wrong," Tyler said, not unkindly, guiding her hand along the grain of the wood, with it, not against it. "I've been doing most things against the grain my whole life," Hannah said. "Seems to work out fine." He almost smiled at that. Almost. They worked in near silence after that, the 3 of them, sawdust and late sun and the small steady sound of sandpaper against wood, and it occurred to Hannah, standing in a house that wasn't fully hers in any way that mattered yet, that she hadn't checked her phone in nearly 2 hours. She couldn't remember the last time that had been true. If you've ever caught yourself slowing down around someone without meaning to, you already know exactly what that afternoon felt like from the inside. Marshall didn't waste time once he was back in his own office. He called an informal session with 2 board members he trusted, framing it strictly as due diligence. Nothing more than that. The Zone C parcel needs to close before quarter's end, he told them, calm and reasonable. Before Hannah gets sentimental about a lake house and starts second-guessing the whole strategy behind it, one of the 2 asked, mildly, why the sudden rush. Marshall said something about market timing, about competitor interest, about windows that don't stay open forever. It wasn't exactly a lie. It also wasn't the reason, and both men in that room half-sensed it without knowing why. In the days between, Hannah sat through 2 separate meetings at Reed Harbor Group, where Marshall spoke about Zone C, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once had to defend a decision in his life. He used words like optimize and unlock, the kind of words that made land sound like a math problem instead of a place where a little girl picked cherries with her father every June. Hannah found herself watching him more closely than she used to, not because she suspected anything specific yet, but because something in the way he moved through a room too smooth, too certain, never once circling back to check his own numbers, had started to bother her in a way she couldn't name. She caught herself, more than once that week, picturing Tyler's hands on a piece of sanded wood instead of Marshall's hands on a projector remote, and told herself it meant nothing, and didn't quite believe it. Diane found what she was looking for 2 days later, in a personal file she'd kept in a home drawer for 6 years, without ever quite admitting to herself why she'd kept it at all. An internal memo, dated, initialed, entirely unambiguous. Marshall Cade, authorizing a cost reduction substitution on retrofit materials for a bridge support system over the written objection of the lead structural engineer of record, Tyler Bishop, whose refusal to certify the work had later been quietly reclassified in his personnel file as insubordination. She read it 3 separate times before she picked up the phone. "There's something you need to see," Diane said, voice careful, deliberate. "And I need you to understand, I could lose my license over showing it to you." Hannah drove to the airport that same night. The memo sat closed on her lap for most of the flight back to Chicago, and still she read it more times than she needed to, because some sentences don't finish landing on the first pass. Tyler Bishop had objected, formally, in writing. Marshall had overruled him, and then rewritten the record, so it looked like the exact opposite had happened. And 5 years ago, on that same stretch of retrofitted roadway, a guardrail failed during a storm, and a car went off the shoulder, and the woman driving it did not survive the night. Hannah didn't need Diane to spell out who that woman had been. The dates did that entirely on their own. She sat with the folder closed in her lap long after the plane had landed, unable to make herself drive anywhere, because there was no direction that felt like the right one toward Tyler with the whole truth, or away from a man who had already lost more than most people lose in a lifetime, sparing him one more blow he hadn't asked for and didn't deserve. She chose, in the end, to drive north. She didn't tell him that first night. She stood outside his workshop instead, in the dark, watching him sand down a table leg under the light of a single bulb, moving with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything he touched, and she understood, maybe for the first time completely, that this was not simply a man who had changed careers. This was a man who had survived something enormous and quietly built an entire life on top of the wreckage of it, one porch swing and one wooden stool at a time, asking nothing of anyone. She didn't go in. She stood there a while longer, and then drove home. And didn't sleep much that night either. Marshall's call came the next afternoon, brisk and businesslike, entirely unaware anything had shifted underneath him. "I need your signature on the Zone C agreement by Friday," he said. "The board's getting impatient, and frankly, so am I." "I'm not signing it," Hannah said. A pause. "Excuse me?" "I said I'm not signing it, Marshall, and I think we should talk about why." His voice cooled by exactly 1 careful degree. "I'd be careful, Hannah. You don't want to make this personal." "It already is personal," she said. "You made sure of that 6 years ago." The line went quiet in a way that told her everything she still needed confirmed. Then his tone shifted, smoother now, more dangerous for how calm it sounded. I'd think very carefully before you go pulling old threads. Hannah, some things unravel further than people expect. His past. The board's confidence in you. Possibly both, if it comes to that. She hung up without answering him. Tyler arrived at the lake house early that same evening to drop off a finished section of porch railing, and found the front door standing half open, Hannah's voice carrying from the kitchen, phone on speaker, Marshall's voice underneath hers, his own name, and the word past, and the word careful, strung together in a way that dropped his stomach out before his mind had fully caught up with what he was hearing. He stood in the doorway a long moment. Then he set the railing down without a sound and left before she saw him standing there. He came back an hour later, and this time he didn't stay quiet about it. "How long have you known?" he asked, standing in her kitchen, jaw tight, voice low in the particular way that meant it was costing him something to keep it that low. Hannah set down the folder she'd been holding, only realizing then that she'd been holding it the whole time. 2 days. 2 days, he repeated. "You've known for 2 days and didn't think to say a word to me?" "I didn't know how," she said. "I didn't know how to hand you the worst thing that's ever happened to you and not make it worse in the handing. That wasn't your call to make for me. You're right. It wasn't." She held his eyes, steady, refusing to look away from what she'd done or hadn't done. "I'm not sorry I found out. I'm sorry it took me 2 days to find the courage to actually tell you. 2 days where I sat in that workshop thinking nothing had changed," he said, "teaching Ruby how to sand a stool, talking about porch swings. While you were sitting on this, I know. Do you have any idea what it's like to find out the worst day of your life had a name attached to it this whole time, and that name was signing your paychecks?" His voice cracked on the last word, and he hated that it did, and didn't try to hide it either. "I don't," Hannah said quietly. "I can't. I just know I wasn't going to let him bury it a second time." Tyler stood there a long moment, breathing hard, the anger still present but no longer the only thing filling the room between them. "Tell me now," he said. "All of it. Don't leave anything out." So she did. She told him about the memo, about Marshall's threat on the phone, about the redevelopment plan aimed squarely at his orchard, about 6 years he'd spent not knowing that someone had quietly rewritten his own record to protect himself at Tyler's expense. She told him she'd already refused to sign, already put her own standing with the board on the line, before she'd even worked out how to tell him any of it at all. "I wasn't trying to protect the company," she said. "I was trying to work out how to protect you, and I did it badly. I know that now." Something in Tyler's shoulders came down, slow, like a breath he'd been holding for longer than tonight. "You put yourself in his crosshairs," he said. "For me, for you and Ruby," Hannah said simply. "That's not a difficult math problem, Tyler." He didn't answer that directly. He didn't need to. He crossed the kitchen, and, for the first time since any of this had begun, took both her hands in his, quiet, nothing declared out loud, the way two people sometimes say the largest things without using a single word for them. Outside, Ruby had wandered up from the orchard, with a jar of fireflies she wanted to show someone, anyone at all, and found the two of them standing close together in the kitchen doorway. Without understanding a thing about memos or boardrooms or 5-year-old accidents, she simply ran forward and wrapped her arms around both of them at once, jar and all, laughing at nothing in particular the way children do when the adults around them have finally stopped holding their breath. Neither of them let go of her, or of each other, for a long moment after that. Marshall didn't wait for the weekend to pass. He called an emergency board session for Thursday morning, framing it internally as a routine acceleration of the Zone C timeline, hoping to close the whole matter before Hannah found solid enough footing to fight it properly and in the open. He should have known better by now. He'd underestimated quiet things before, and paid for it before, and somehow it never seemed to stick as a lesson. Hannah walked into that boardroom Thursday morning with Diane's memo tucked under her arm, and a version of herself she hadn't fully met until that same week. She laid the document flat on the table without any preamble at all. "Before anyone votes on Zone C," she said, "I think the board needs to see this first." Marshall's face didn't move, which was its own kind of answer, plain as anything spoken. She read the memo aloud, every line of it, including the date of the retrofit, the name of the engineer who had objected formally in writing, and the falsified record that had buried his objection under a single dishonest word. She laid out, plainly and without theatrics, the accident that followed that decision, and the woman who hadn't survived it, and the 5 years a man had spent believing his career had simply ended on its own, rather than knowing it had been taken from him deliberately by someone sitting in that very room. The room went very still, the kind of stillness that has weight to it. One board member, an older woman named Carol, who had sat on that board longer than anyone else in the room, took off her glasses and set them down on the table without a word, staring at Marshall like she was seeing him for the first time in a decade of sitting 3 seats away from him. Another simply looked down at his own hands. A board member asked, carefully, whether there was anyone present who could confirm the account firsthand. For the record, the door opened before Hannah could answer that herself. Tyler stood in the doorway, still in his work jacket, having driven 3 hours on almost no sleep because he'd decided, somewhere around the 2nd hour of that drive, that this was not a fight Hannah should have to finish standing alone. "I can," he said. He walked to the front of the room and told them, briefly and without embellishment, exactly what had happened 6 years earlier, the objection he'd filed, the decision overruled above him, the paperwork falsified afterward, and the 5 quiet years since, spent building a different, smaller life, because he genuinely believed there was nothing left of the old one worth reaching back for. When he finished, no one in that room spoke for a long moment. The vote, when it finally came, wasn't close. 7 against the Zone C proposal, 1 abstention, none in favor of moving forward. A second motion followed almost immediately after, suspending Marshall's advisory role pending a full internal review of the matter. Marshall stood, gathered nothing because there was nothing left worth gathering, and walked out of that boardroom without a single word, the door closing behind him louder than he'd probably intended it to. The orchard survived, not merely spared from development, but formally designated within the month as part of the town's protected heritage grounds, cherry trees that would outlast every person in that boardroom, standing exactly where they'd always stood, unaware of how close they'd come to being paved over for a number on a spreadsheet. Diane kept her job. The board, once the full record came fully to light, found it difficult to argue she'd done anything but the right thing, 5 years too late and later than she'd wanted. But in time to matter, in the end, when it counted most, Tyler didn't go back to engineering. He was asked, more than once in the weeks after, by firms who'd suddenly remembered his name meant something worth calling about. He turned every offer down, gently, the same way he'd turned down most things that used to matter to a man he wasn't fully anymore. What he kept instead was the workshop, the orchard, and an afternoon light that fell across sawdust in a way that had come to mean more to him than any bridge ever had, no matter how many people once called him brilliant for building them. Hannah split her time after that, Chicago during the week, Traverse City every weekend she could manage, and eventually more weeks than not, until Diane stopped bothering to ask when she'd be back, and started simply asking whether she wanted anything picked up on the way. Reed Harbor Group kept the Lake House project on its books, quietly, as a kind of standing joke among the staff, the one property nobody expected the CEO to ever actually sell. Ruby got to keep both of them, which, in the end, was the part she cared about most and understood best, long before either adult had fully worked it out for themselves. A year later, the summer festival returned to the same square, the same smell of cherry syrup and grilled corn, the same string lights strung crooked between the same 2 lampposts. Ruby, taller now, missing a front tooth she was proud of, rode on Tyler's shoulders exactly the way she had the summer before, laughing at nothing in particular the way she always did. Hannah walked beside them, holding 2 lemonades instead of 1, already knowing which hand Ruby would reach for first. The same neighbor from the year before wandered past, delighted to see all 3 of them again, and asked, half joking, whether they'd finally made things official yet. Somewhere behind them, the fiddle player had found his key this time, and a few couples had started drifting toward the open patch of grass near the bandstand that passed, in Traverse City, for a dance floor. Ruby had already spotted a friend from school and gone running off toward the funnel cake stand without asking permission, confident enough in the two of them, now that she didn't think twice about leaving them alone together for a minute. Tyler looked at Hannah. This time, she didn't just smile. She reached over, laced her fingers through his in front of everyone, in front of the whole square, in front of a year's worth of people who'd watched this story unfold in pieces, without ever once needing it explained to them, and let the answer speak entirely for itself. The neighbor laughed, delighted, and moved on down the row of stalls without waiting for a verbal answer, because she hadn't really needed one. People once mistook them for husband and wife. This time, no one was mistaken at all, because there was nothing left standing between them worth denying.